It's now my pleasure to introduce our panelists who will be focusing on the duty to accommodate injured workers this afternoon. Please welcome Mark Wolf of Hyde HR Law, Bill Howitt of Howitt HR, Nicole Gorman of Cisco Canada, Sheila Robinson of IMS Group, and Melissa Mannion of Medcore Canada. All right. So, Mark, let's start with you. What are the key responsibilities of an employer when it comes to accommodating an injured worker?
Thanks, Brandy. So ultimately, the core responsibility that employers have is to provide reasonable accommodations up to the point of undue hardship. And that's a very contextual thing, both in terms of what would be reasonable in the circumstances and what things the employer doesn't need to do because they constitute undue hardship. Um, there's not any kind of single, clear definition of what undue hardship is. An employer can be required to do things that do create some operational challenges or disruptions and have some costs, but there's a line, and it's a line drawing exercise that needs to be done on a case by case basis. But more broadly, this duty has two kind of key components. One is a procedural duty, which is going through the process, considering an accommodation request in good faith and, looking at all the opportunities for accommodating the worker. And then, and that also involves seeking, medical information where necessary to determine, what the employee's limitations are so that you can actually make an informed decision about, what reasonable accommodations you could offer them. And then there's also a substantive component to the duty, which is actually offering the reasonable accommodations up to the point of undue hardship. So it can get a lot more complicated in specific cases, but that is it in a nutshell.
I'm going to just ask if anyone has anything to add. Feel free to jump in. That's how we're going to run this panel this afternoon. All right. So then, what are some of the common mistakes you see employers making when it comes to accommodating injured workers? And I'm going to start with you, Melissa.
I think there are a few common items we see on our end that tend to be at the beginning of injury management, actually. So we see a lack of confidence in managing an injury at the site level or knowing where to send someone, where employers then struggle on how to accommodate workers. They don't know, do we have to think within the confines of their job description, or can we be more creative and find something else to do, whether it's filing paperwork or doing something else that's outside of the regular job scopes. And then the workers don't always know what their accommodations are, and what might be available after they seek care. So then they just follow what the doctors say. And right now, especially in our healthcare world, we're seeing where a lot of doctors are saying, here, just take some time off, get better. And so then we're stuck with, what do we do now?
And I can add to that just from the employer perspective. We have a strapped healthcare system, as you said, and
Mm.
that's why utilizing a modified work offer, almost like an agreement where you are sitting down with the employer, you're running through their functional limitations. And you're saying, here's what we're going to have you do. Let's agree on this. This is the duration of this agreement, and then reassess after new medical is given to you.
I think those are both great points. I can add to that as well. I actually practice on both sides representing employees and employers, so I've seen it go wrong from both ends. But one common mistake is just delays in the process. One of the components of reasonably accommodating a worker is doing it in a prompt fashion. Another is, not seeking fulsome information about what the actual limitations are, because if you're not fully informed on what the limitations are, you're not going to be able to make an informed decision about what accommodations you may need. And then two other common mistakes I see. One is employers seeking information that they're not entitled to. You are permitted to seek information about what the limitations are, what the anticipated duration of those limitations are, whether the employee is receiving treatment and the anticipated duration of that treatment, and whether the employee can, safely perform the essential duties of their job. But the employer is not entitled to, their diagnosis, for example. And that's something, unfortunately, a lot of employers, miss the mark on. And one final piece is sometimes employers jump to an IME very prematurely. You can only require an employee to undergo an IME where there's a reasonable basis for, believing that the information being provided by the employee's doctor is not accurate. Where there's internal contradictions or things of that nature, where you have serious concerns, you do have to try to go through the employee's own physician first, generally.
Anyone have anything they'd like to add?
just from
All right.
just for me, I guess, and that is the I just talked a little bit about the job jars, and they're named different things, in every province, but that's something that's definitely helped. Goes along with what Nicole was talking about, was just those offers of work. They're value added. They're work that needs to be done. They're not trivial. They're not meaningless. They're actual work that has to be done, and you sort of make that immediate offer of modified duties until you can get to that next medical. But it is important to have the injured employee agree that that's something that they can do. They feel comfortable doing it. They understand what they're going to be doing. And if they have any hesitations or they're worried that maybe they can't perform it, or maybe it feels unsafe for them with this new injury, that they have that chance to talk, and you can remove that duty from them. So I think it does go a long way to that communication and having those duties pre-assembled.
All right. And I apologize, everyone. I should have mentioned right off the top that we do have lots of time for questions during this panel. So if you've got anything you'd like to ask any one of our panelists, feel free to drop it into the Q&A box. In the meantime, I will continue with a question. This one is for you, Bill. What are some of the challenges you've seen in accommodating psychological injuries, and how do the most successful organizations overcome them?
Yeah, I think to start with this, I'm going to break it into two parts. I think part one is actually understand a part of your accommodation strategy is also being mindful of how they're happening. So I think part one is I like to try to get employers to think about the challenge I've seen over the years with this whole accommodation strategy is that people go out and there's a race to bring them back. I equate it to a fish tank. If you think about the workplace like a fish tank, if I went away, you don't have to be even an expert with a fish tank, but if I went away from the fish tank and I came back and all my fish were dead, I am not going to throw in 2 new fish. The first thing I'm going to do is going to clean the tank. So one of the biggest challenge I find with this is we're looking at individual versus system repairs. So for example, the very first thing we do is to challenge employers up front and say, things are going to happen. Psychosocial factors, what they are, things that drain and charge employees. Frequency, duration, and intensity will lead to what's called a psychosocial hazard. At the end of the day, to make this very simple, a mental illness is a functional impairment. A person doesn't need to actually have a psychological injury to qualify to have a mental illness, vice versa. They can be a separate ordinance. So when someone experiences mental harm from their experience in the workplace, there could be a lot of different things that are root cause. It could be workplace. If you kind of pay attention to what's happening in the world right now, there's a bunch of geopolitical factors, different things, people's adversity loads coming in, and people's reactivity is higher. So the first thing is employers need to understand people are going to be stressed. Things do happen. Even with the best scenario, the wrong time to prepare is when crises happen. So we'll say someone goes off. What were some of the common things, for example, in the province of Nova Scotia, for example, or Ontario, other places around the country, if someone is bullied, harassed, whatever it may be, and they go off, and they qualify for a psychological injury, whether it's WCB or other insurance, which people go off for leaves, regardless of the why. Once a person goes off, now we know they've gone off. Up front, first point, fish tank, protective factors. What do we do to try to mitigate injuries? Now, if they go off, I've seen patients for nearly 40 years. In the part, there's a difference between a treatment plan and a reentry plan. So for example, when someone goes off the workplace, one of the big things is being mindful they're still human beings. It's what's your process to stay connected to them? Ensuring that I would lead teams, I would say, listen, did you know sometimes people go off work? And sometimes things happen. I don't really care why someone goes off work, whether it's a ski injury, pregnancy, it doesn't make any difference. When you're off, what do you like us to do? I want to be private. I care about you. So setting that up in your design that when someone goes off, because stigma and awareness and loneliness is a factor. So how a person continue to be a human and help them in their treatment plan. The return to work plan is a different factor. As a practitioner seeing patients, I do a treatment plan regardless of what the root cause the antecedent is. That is not the same as a reentry plan or a return to work plan, whether it's gradual, et cetera, or other. And the thing about mental health accommodations, they can usually cost like 24 cents. They're not difficult, many of them. But it's a little bit of tolerance and having some mindfulness of what's going on. But here's the deal: stigma awareness, individual needs and evaluation, ensuring you have some resources available. You know, EAP is great. I get that stuff, and some of the benefits are great. But not every EAP person is trained to deal with every issue that could actually be antecedent to someone's issue, whether it's trauma, domestic violence, whatever it may be. So trying to help make sure that people have the right resources and support. Not everyone needs cognitive behavioral therapy. Not everyone needs to meditate. Not everyone needs to do that. There's actually having practitioners. I specialize in psychotraumatology and addictive disorders. Did my postdoc UCLA in this. So that would create the illusion that I know a little bit about this. But what would happen is it'd be helpful to ensure that employers are paying attention to their network, support network, and helping making sure that, and then training your leaders to understand what their role is for return to work, and understand you're spending time and understanding that peers know what their role is. I have more than once gone to a team and said, listen, we got someone returning to work. I don't really have to tell them why. They're gonna do a gradual return to work. I can remember one employee saying to me one time, said, well, why do I have to do their work? And my response, because they knew me, because we do the very same thing for you. Set a standard, talk about it up front. The wrong time to prepare for crisis when you're in it. That's why I spent a lot of time doing crisis ready training and preparation with folks, as you know. The last thing is not only the treatment plan piece, but the return to work plan. Is I'm really big a promoter and actually finding out what the employee experience was off work and return to work, and having at the end of it, have an evaluation using a plan, do, check, act. Did they leave? Was there things that we could avoid it because of dirty fish tank? Are there things that we can improve? Did they go off? Did they have good access, good programming? Are we evaluating to ensure that they're doing? Are we getting a bang for a buck? Do your own evaluations of what your mental health support services are. And then when they come back to work, how did we do? Get a grade. It's not about creating fear. A psychological safe workplace is creating the possibility of vulnerability, yes, but accountability and learning. And if we can do that, we can mitigate harm. But even with the best cultures, stuff happens. We just need to be open to the possibility when people go off, coming back to a dirty fish tank and wondering why they can't function, regardless of what the treatment plan is. I've seen thousands of patients. That's one of the reasons why I went back and got back into organizations. It's like, I can't fix the system, but the system's often a part of the challenge. So that's my 2 cents. I would look forward to other panels to comments.
I like the comment, just switching gears from someone who has been off work for an extended period of time and has returned to work. Having even checklists for your frontline supervisors and leaders on how to properly ease someone back into the workplace can help them be a little more okay with having that employee back, because then they have that guidance to fall back on, to those prompts. Often people will be cleared for, say, full duties, whether it's mental or physical. That doesn't mean they get thrown into the lion's den. It should be eased, it should be gradual, and it should be about communicating that not only with the supervisors and the injured employee, but the coworkers that they're working with might have to pick up some of the excess work, and they need to understand that we're an open, holistic employer, and that we will accommodate you if you ever need to go off, as Bill said, asking that question to your employees: what would you want us to do if you went off?
Hey, Nicole, may I add one point? I think
Yeah.
one thing I'd like to say to you, said something I think is really important for people to be mindful. Because we have the ordinance doesn't mean it's the right medicine. What I mean by that, I have lots of patients. I'm a 60-year-old type A personality. When I come back to work, if someone tells me to slow down, there's going to be a problem. because I define work for me is good. I've always thought work is good for me. But other people, to your point, that gradual piece, I think that needs to be a part of the reentry and has to be some decisions on that. And we all have to have a part of that. I find what I get worried about, and I think you said something important, is let's not use universal prescriptions of telling someone what's good for them. Let's listen and learn from the treatment planning. Let's listen to the client. Let's listen. And the other thing I didn't mention, we had some input in helping. I think Alberta used some of the stuff through AMSA is around psychological demand workload. Sometimes, depending on the function, we might want to calibrate where they're at, and to your point, and put them in adjunct tasks with different cognitive abilities so they can get their confidence back sometimes too. So I think your points are very well important to keep.
All right. We're going to switch gears a little bit now, and this next question is for you, Sheila. How should an employer prepare to welcome an injured employee back into a modified role?
Well, I think in my experience, and again, we've talked about this, I think everyone's touched on it today, is just that communication is so important when somebody gets hurt. From my experience, unfortunately, I was injured as a paramedic and there was no conversation at all about return to work, recover at work, modified duty, nothing. You were either a paramedic or you were at home, and you were left at home until there was, every month, there'd be a new medical come out and my employer would give me a call. So I really think it's important just to keep that conversation going, keep communicating with them, talking with them, and then when it's time to reintegrate them back into work or start talking about that recover at work, return to work program, is to set up a meeting with them, maybe with their healthcare provider, if they can be a part of it, so their physio, whoever that might be, and then just talk about what it's going to look like. So it's going to be different when they return back to work. But, the shift times will be the same. What about a supervisor? Are they going to still be in their same department? Or because they need a little bit of light duty for a while, are we moving them to a different department? So they'll have a new supervisor, new start time. A lot of it just alleviates that anxiety that we go through when, we've been gone from work for a long time. So bringing them in, having that talk, and setting out those realistic expectations for return to work, even how they're going to handle doing light duty or modified duty and attending their physio appointments to make sure, their counseling appointments to make sure that the recovery stays on track, are so integral. So what does that look like? When should the appointments be? What time can they leave work to go do that? Just making it as user-friendly as possible for everybody and making sure, I think that communication is strong is really beneficial for everybody involved.
Nicole, this next one is for you. Recovery isn't always linear. How can employers accommodate employees who experience setbacks in the recovery after an injury?
That's a great question, Brandy. I recommend, as the theme of this is leading with empathy and understanding, first and foremost. A setback in recovery can be extremely stressful on an injured worker. Remember that this is not only affecting their ability to do their job, but also their ability to function in their personal life, whether that's interacting with their family, friends, sports, hobbies. Next, it is important to have a documented guidance from the treating healthcare professional on what the setback means in terms of limitations or restrictions in the workplace. This will provide you, the employer, with information on what you need to adjust for the worker's current modified duties. It may mean lowering the maximum weight they can lift or adjusting their duties to include additional breaks or the ability to switch off between sedentary and light duties. It could also be helpful to speak with the injured worker about what might have contributed to their setback from a workplace perspective. So don't just assume it was something in their personal life that caused the setback. Have they been working within their limitations? Do they feel they are being pushed to do more? And if so, where is that pressure coming from? Is it coming from supervisors? Is it coming from perception of peers? This might open conversation to allow for a good dialogue between you and the employee, so you can address any workplace related factors that could be contributing to a recovery setback. Also, I recommend that if we talked about employee assistance programs, but if you're an employer that does have that, that you review that resource with your injured worker. Recovering from a physical injury, as we've mentioned previously, can cause mental strain and increase stress on the injured worker. This can help prevent a secondary claim being made for adjustment disorder or other related psychological injury. And as you always know, remember that prevention is better than the cure. So it's better to do these things up front than try to pick up the pieces afterwards.
Does anyone have anything they'd like to build on that with?
I like the part, I think that message around a personalized journey is really, really important. And I also think sometimes we forget the fallibility of how the mind and the body is connected. And I'll give you an example. You may not know when I say what your quadratus rectus spinus region is, when I say that, just for shits and giggles. But if you have someone that actually had a back injury and all of a sudden they have actually additional tension stress load, that'll actually shorten their back and can increase the strain on a physiological injury because of what's happening. Now, what sometimes people forget is all an emotion is a neurochemical, period. And so some neurochemicals, for example, unpleasant emotions are cortisol or other ones. And all thought is a neurochemical. And I think what sometimes people forget is that your mind and your body are very, very connected. And one of the big things I see when people are under stress or injury, they don't, for example, gut health is one of the most important things because that's where all your neurotransmitters are made. They're not made in your head. And so when you have people that don't pay attention to their health and their battery, as Nicole suggests, is not fully charged, their susceptibility for a little setback or a breakdown, whether it's a physiological or even their mental state, can change how they're perceiving pain. And that's what people sometimes forget. Got to remember when your fight or flight system's on and you activate cortisol levels, that can numb sometimes to your pain sensor. So you sometimes will push through pain when you shouldn't be. Right. So and then all of a sudden something more seriously happens. So I really like that comment she made.
All right. We are going to dip into audience questions now. Mark, someone is asking for clarification that you mentioned that as an employer, you're not allowed to know the diagnosis, but you can know someone's prognosis. They want to know if that's correct.
That's generally correct. You can't require the employee to disclose what their medical diagnosis is. There's, it's even more of a problem in certain jurisdictions like BC where there is privacy legislation. But more broadly, that is, really the kind of the case across the country. That said, if the employee or their doctor, goes out of their way to disclose their diagnosis, that's not a problem, but you can't require them to provide that. And, I'll also say that sometimes the limitations, you do have the right to know the limitations. Sometimes kind of fulsome information about the limitations will basically make the diagnosis kind of obvious. So that's one of the, kind of a wrinkle there that sometimes it'll sort of become obvious, just based on what the limitations are. But it is something to be careful of, that you're not, demanding to know what the diagnosis is. And, similar to, I also mentioned that you can seek, you can ask whether they're undergoing treatment and the anticipated duration of that treatment. You generally shouldn't be asking what the treatment itself is for this sort of the same reason, because it can reveal, what the diagnosis is. And ultimately, the human rights tribunals and courts have made it clear that the employer can only require information that they reasonably need to be able to fulfill their duties in providing the reasonable accommodations. And generally speaking, the diagnosis itself is not generally required. It's really the work-related limitations resulting from the medical condition that need to be accommodated. So hopefully that kind of helps clarify.
Thank you. One participant has noted that wait lists for healthcare have been getting worse and worse for everything, but especially psychological treatment. What strategies can we use to help manage uncertainty around healthcare access?
Are we talking about mental health or general? Like there's a,
I think we're asking about both in this case.
yeah, one of the things that I'm noticing, and I'm not an expert in it, but I'm noticing firms like Green Shield and the other insurance companies, Blue Crosses and et cetera, leveraging more service like Maple and different access of what I guess they call it digital healthcare. And I know there's more focus on getting rapid access to cognitive behavioral therapy, different online tools. I find one of the things is many of the big insurance companies now are building out different networks for building capacity. And what I mean by that, I talk to a lot of big insurance companies, and I'll just share one thing I've been told recently, whether it's true or not, maybe some of the panel could tell me, but traditionally the benefit providers were kind of like insurance companies. You provided a couple of insurance things. Then they made the migration into kind of becoming more focus on paramedical chiropractors and access to psychological services. It seems now they're starting to move into health providing, trying to get more access to rapid health. Like I notice, like big firms like a TELUS would buy, I forget which one they bought, Medicaid or one of those things where clients can get access to bricks and mortar and online and different things. So I don't have all the answers, but I know they're the big insurance companies and others and provinces especially too are trying. And great organizations like the Canadian Mental Health Association of each province, they're fantastic. They know a lot of what's going on in your community, and they're great friendly resources.
I think another resource or another strategy to consider is, if you have the organization strength or breadth, is to consider providing clinics on your work sites. This is something that we do regularly, and then we bring worksite health and wellness right to the workers. They don't need to go to a doctor. They can see a nurse right then and there, and they can ask questions. And so not only are injuries being managed from a workplace perspective, their general health is being managed. When they have questions and they're not sure, they get that education. Am I okay? And they're able to really kind of look at that overall thing, and we can help navigate. The paramedics and nurses that are in these clinics, they can navigate you to the right place. You've got something in your eye. You don't actually need to go sit in the ER. Let's go to the eye doctor and let's help get you an appointment and see what needs to be done. Or, to add to what Bill said, this is a little more complex. Let's see what your programs have. Do you have a benefit provider that can connect you to Maple or things like that? Let's make sure we're getting you that holistic care without you ever needing to leave your workplace.
Yeah, and just to add to that, they are realizing that this is good business because it's prevention. It's secondary and tertiary prevention of further injury or harm. And insurance companies are realizing that's a way that they can save costs as well. So they're really investing in these programs. Nova Scotia, for example, the government, I believe they have an app now for mental health to help get you through those wait times as best they can. And it's really helping the community.
All right, so we have lots of questions about the fish tank and managing that fish tank. And how do we ensure people aren't taking advantage of our environment in the fish tank? Bill, do you have any thoughts there?
I'm going to say I'll start with something. Hopefully, it doesn't get anyone too mad. I think there's more people in need than people faking need. So I think one of the things that I try to tell people is that being sick is not a really good experience, and sometimes we have the 98-2 theory. We had a bad experience with one person, and we assume 98% of the population will be like that. I'm not going to say there's not people to play games, but that's not where I would start. I would start with is actually put in the conditions, put in accommodations, put in the expectations. Just because someone has an issue, and I say this all the time, I'll use the example of occupational health and safety, for example. I don't really care what a person's mental health issue is, as long as they have to be in the workplace, they have to know right from wrong. and they can't be impeding someone else's functionality. And if they can't, they're not ready for the workplace. And so what we want to do, the fish tank, is that construct of what we can do from a psychological safety. That's could be a whole nother conversation of all the different things you could do to help with the fish tank. But the thing I would like to encourage is that and again, I'd love to hear what the panel says. If you've actually have someone on a mental health accommodation, it's kind of challenging if the people who are facilitating it actually have never been actually trained in what their role is, or they don't actually have a basic foundation in how to facilitate support on accommodation. We have to remember how it works. An employer has what's called a duty to inquire. Once they establish there is a functional impairment, it's not a performance issue. Based on the Supreme Court, they reasonably ought to know that something's wrong. They don't have to be a therapist. If I go start my car and it doesn't start, I reasonably ought to know there's something wrong. If I have an employee that was doing X, Y, and Z and doing really good, and all of a sudden there's having some behavior that's showing a pattern, I reasonably ought to know something's wrong. Then once the employee has a responsibility, duty to inform. They don't have to inform me what their issue is, as Mark said, but they have to be able to explain what's going on. And if they have a personal issue, they can get professional help. If it's a peer beating them up or scaring the hell out of them, we can go deal with that. But what we have to understand, there's an issue. And then we have to put in a plan to absolutely to map out that they have an opportunity. But real quick, capacity, the people who are facilitating this, I'm often see I have to go do some training to teach them what their role is. And it doesn't mean people get to do whatever the heck they want to. We can put boundaries in. They drove the work okay. They dressed them okay. They might have some reactivity. They might have some different things. But you know one thing I try to tell people, and again, I've seen patients for 40 years, so I'm not just, I might have a different view than other people. My personal trainer is quite okay with me being a little bit uncomfortable by times. So that's a part of it. Sometimes you're going to be a little bit uncomfortable. You just have to, we have to have the support to help them through that. This is being a human being. And the key to mental health is learning how to live well when you feel unwell. So it's okay there's going to be some unpleasant emotion. It's okay to be scared. But if we don't have the people that are supporting, have a snowball clue what it is, then it becomes binary. They can't be here. They just it's like the school teacher. Be quiet, get out of the room. Like it's because they may not know. That's just one person's thoughts on it.
I think that those are a lot of great points from Bill. And I would add that Bill is completely correct about the duty to inquire. Whenever an employer has any reasonable basis for thinking that an employee may require accommodations based on any protected ground, including disability, obviously, they have a duty to inquire into that and determine if they actually do, require accommodations. That's, well-established law. And one thing that where it can be more, where employers often fall short in that regard is where the issue is regarding substance abuse or alcoholism, where, they're seeing performance problems and it becomes apparent that this has something to do with, them being intoxicated. And, oftentimes employers don't recognize that substance abuse and alcohol dependence, is a disability. It does require reasonable accommodation. You can't simply fire someone for it. But it's a fine line because, just because somebody's, drug use or alcohol use is interfering with their work, they may or may not actually have a dependence. It may or may not actually be a disability, but the employer needs to, fulfill that duty to inquire and determine that. Otherwise, they're potentially exposing themselves to a whole lot of liability. And one other piece I would just add in terms of the original question of, people, employees potentially taking advantage of the situation. One thing that a lot of people are not aware of is that employees are not entitled to their kind of perfect or preferred form of accommodation. Ultimately, the employer is, legally entitled to determine what the accommodation is, so long as that accommodation is reasonable in the circumstances. So just because the employee would prefer to be accommodated in a different way, they may not be entitled to that specific accommodation. That being said, if it's not too much trouble to give the employee their preferred a form of accommodation, if it's not going to create undue hardship, it's generally going to be best to actually give them that, because it's going to be supportive of them. It's going to make them feel heard. And, just from kind of as a practical matter, that's going to help your workplace culture, and it's going to prevent, acrimony in the accommodation process, which is going to help you avoid a lot of problems before they arise.
Okay, Mark, this question is for you. A little bit of background. This person's organization has been told that as an employer, they should consider revisiting the signature portion of their functional limitations form and consider the need for a doctor signature, as it could result in knowing an employee's diagnosis. For example, if their medical note was signed by an oncologist, that lets the employer know the person's condition is cancer. What are your thoughts on that?
So first off, I'm just going to preface this with, I'm not here to provide any specific legal advice on any, particular situations here today, just to provide general, information. So, you should seek specific legal advice before you kind of make decisions or take any specific steps. That said, I will say in general, it's one of those things where, unless you're, as the employer, you're really seeking out that diagnosis information, you're going to have fairly minimal risk, where it may just kind of, tangentially be revealed by, the identity of the physician that you're seeing. And ultimately, the employer, needs to be able to be sure of who is providing this medical opinion, and ensure that it's coming from a medical, professional, not someone else. So, if you really want to be risk averse, you could, try to find ways to get around that. But I can't say that I've ever seen this be an issue where an employer has faced any liability, whether in a human rights context or before the courts, simply because they require, a doctor to identify who they are, or to sign an FAF.
Okay, thank you. I have a question here about preferred form of accommodation. Person would like to know how to navigate the conversation on recommendations made and plans for the person's workstation that they may or may not agree to, and if any of the panelists have case studies from their own experience that they could share.
I'm happy to start off here. I'm sure others will have other pieces to add. So I actually have a few kind of ongoing cases right now involving these types of situations. One is an employee who is dealing with some mental health issues, and her preferred form of accommodation would be working from home. And she has, basically provided her employer with a letter from both her doctor and her therapist, stating that, that's what they recommend, and they think that this would reduce her symptoms. And that's really what she's hoping for. And right now she's kind of in limbo to find out how, whether the employer is going to grant this request or not. But at the end of the day, unfortunately, a lot of employers, even where, the core duties don't really require the employee to be in the workplace, a lot of employers simply have a preference for having the employees in the workplace. They feel it's easier to kind of supervise them, ensure that they're, actually doing their work versus, whatever else someone might do at home. There's been a shift over time with COVID. Obviously, everyone was working from home, and then, work from home arrangements were far more common than they ever were. And now we're seeing a bit of a transition to, people working back in the office. But at the end of the day, it's not up to the physician or, medical professional to determine the accommodation. They can find that a particular accommodation is not, safe for them, that they can't do that in light of their limitations. So the physicians do have a say in that regard. But, simply saying, this person, I recommend that this person works from home, the employer can then, ask for further information. What are the limitations that are, are the basis for you making this recommendation? Because the employer may have other ways of accommodating that person. Perhaps there is a difficult interpersonal relationship between that worker and one of their colleagues, and perhaps, slightly modifying their duties so they don't have to interact with that person might also address the problem. So there can be, multiple reasonable ways to accommodate a person. But, at the end of the day, when an employee isn't given their preferred form of accommodation, they generally don't appreciate that. So again, when it is possible and feasible to, give that preferred form of accommodation, it's usually the path of least resistance.
Yeah, and I'm going to add something, and I'm not going to try to start a fight with you, Mark. But I think one of the things that I'm observing is that sometimes we don't understand the terms of the length of an accommodation. So I think sometimes will happen and again working with patients is that there's a reasonable part for them to be learning how to be dealing with their reactivity. But if they have a personality issue or a conflict with someone else, a part of their treatment plan that I work with them on this is to remediate that conflict, to repair the conflict. And we have a lot of people that avoid conflict. Then they don't like dealing with conflict because it's hard. And even if you don't have a mental health issue, it can be hard. So I think sometimes what we do is employers get to scratch their head, and I do a lot of work with large employers as well as in this area. And when I review or have to talk to docs about accommodations for employers, I say, okay, so to what end? How long? Where are we going to on this? It's because a part of the concept is for them also. There's a part of the development part, and I think sometimes we forget that. Is Bandura even talked back in the old days of? Sometimes some people are part of the root cause of their stress and strain, anxiety is some developmental skills they haven't gotten. And with that, they're in symptom load. I get that. Let's ameliorate the symptom load. But if you don't know how to develop relationships, you don't know how to resolve conflict, you don't know how to receive feedback, and you're concerned about you don't understand you're not going to be perfect, and you don't feel safe making mistakes, it's going to be hard to grow and learn. So I think sometimes what clients sometimes don't understand, it doesn't have to necessarily be forever. And I think that's where sometimes employers struggle. I don't know what the other folks in the panel think. It's easy for someone to write something that might help now, but how does that help them in their own career development and growth?
I do have something to add, more building on what Mark was saying about preferred accommodation. It does switch gears a little bit. It's more on the occupational health and safety side. I've had a case in the past where an employee had a personal related injury, a concussion from a motor vehicle accident, and they worked in a warehouse environment, which is noisy. There's lots of fluorescent lights. There's backup alarms, there's many things happening. And their occupational therapist at the time had recommended Bose noise canceling headphones, but that introduced a safety hazard for that individual, because then they cannot hear backup alarms. They cannot hear when someone's beeping or yelling at them to get out of the way, and that could really harm them. They could get run over. Sorry, saving the environment over here with darkness. So, um, and basically, what we had to do is really work with the OT, the occupational therapist, and the employee. Let's find a common ground here. We need to ensure their safety. We cannot give the preferred accommodation because it impedes their ability to be in the workplace safely. But let's look at ear protection. Can we give certain decibel level ear protection where we know that they'll still be able to hear to a reasonable degree the backup alarms and sounds, and so that protects them, but also doesn't contribute to their concussion related symptoms. Basically communicating with all parties. The theme of our conversation here is making sure you just work through those concerns as a team.
Okay, great. We have lots of questions remaining. We could have this conversation all day, I'm sure, but unfortunately, that is all the time we have left for our panel. So thank you all for joining us today and answering questions. We all appreciate it, I'm sure.